As you may have seen when you logged in this morning, our students in the Beit Midrash put together a heartfelt and powerful Hallel, singing together for Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan. We'll be releasing later today something Lady Cooper put together around how to sing Hallel in times like this, how and why. The team in Israel is also extremely focused on providing mental and emotional support for the students in addition to their physical safety, and they've been providing a whole list of opportunities from yoga and meditation to additional learning and free one-on-one sessions with therapists. And we want to thank our board, who has been tremendous at making sure those opportunities could happen. Now we want to dedicate the learning that will begin in just a moment, and really this whole series, Torah as Light, to the loved ones and our most intimate Pardes family who've been called into service. So you'll see in just a moment all of the names that we're learning in their merit, in their honor, in the chat. And we invite you now, if you have someone on your mind, please put their name in the chat in whatever form, English, Hebrew. If you want to dedicate your learning today to someone, now is the time. You could just throw it into the chat. A final brief note about our style of learning, and then we'll jump in. Today's session will be a full hour. We wanted to really launch this and really speak to the moment and give people what we heard they wanted, which was more Torah to help them, guide them through this time. If you cannot stay the full hour, we completely understand, and you can jump off whenever you want. Going forward, all these learnings will be 30 minutes. We will keep to it. We want this to be just a bite of light in the middle of Folks' Day or at the end of Folks' Day, depending where you're tuning in from. Also, while Pardes programs typically really have at the cornerstone of it chavrutza, of being with one other person and using your life and the text to engage meaningfully, we decided in this space to forego that. Everyone is coming in from a different emotional place and holding different things, and in different environments. We want to honor our value of being together in a sense of active. So now it's my pleasure to hand it off to Dean Bernstein. Thank you for being with us here today, and thank you to everyone who is adding their names of those that you are dedicating your learning to.
Thank you, Faith. Thank you to everyone who's here. I know that it's the middle of your workday, and for people in Israel, I know it's evening time already. So thank you very much for joining. There's an adage that there are only two things that are certain in life. And that, of course, is death and taxes. This question of uncertainty is on my mind now. Napoleon is quoted as once having said, "War is the kingdom of uncertainty." But even when there isn't a war going on, we all live with uncertainty. It was brought home to me and to the older people in this session on 9/11. It was brought home again when Lehman Brothers simply disappeared. It's for the younger people, imagine that tomorrow morning, all of a sudden, Microsoft or Apple disappeared. It's totally unexpected, totally out of the realm of what we could have predicted. And of course, all of us here experienced the pandemic. And who would have known, who would have thought that we'd be walking around with masks, that so many people would unfortunately die, that we would still feel the after effects in 2023. Those things point to the uncertainty that is very much a part of our lives. So if life is so uncertain, where does it leave us? How can we live in a world where nothing except death and taxes is for certain? And I want to start by saying that I could bring you sources from our tradition that seem to indicate that if you do X, Y will certainly happen. Right? If we just look at the Ashrei prayer, Shomer Hashem et kol oavav ve'et kol reshaim yashmid. God will guard over those who love him, and the evil ones he will destroy. And yet we know it's not true. We know it's not true. And the rabbis knew it was not true. It's part of our liturgy, it's part of our tradition. And I think there are reasons for that, and we'll talk about them in a little while. But the rabbis dealt with the question of, for example, tzaddik viralo, righteous people who suffer, virasha v'tovlo, people who are evil, prospering, and succeeding. And the rabbis tried to deal with it in different ways. It's a recognition that those reassurances, and they have their place, those reassurances, don't always work. In fact, oftentimes don't work. And so what I'd like to do is take us through some other sources that I think talk about the uncertainty of life from the perspective of Jewish tradition, and perhaps also give us a measure of instruction about how to cope with that terrible uncertainty that we all live with. So let's go to the first source. Thank you, Monica, for doing this. The first source that I've chosen is from the Chumash, from the 5th book of the 5 books of Moses, Sefer Dvarim, the book of Deuteronomy. And let's see. Aliyah, I saw your face before. How'd you like to read either in Hebrew or in English? Source 1. Can we unmute her?
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I can read English. For the land to which you are coming to possess is not the land like the land of Egypt, out of which you came, where you sowed your seed and which you watered by foot like a vegetable garden, but the land to which you pass to possess, in a land of mountains and valleys and absorbs water from the rains of heaven, a land the Lord your God looks after. The eyes of the Lord your God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And it will be, if you hearken to my commandments, that I will command you to this day to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and all your soul.
So there's not surprisingly, a disagreement between two of the Rishonim, two of the medieval commentators, about how to understand these verses. And the disagreement was between Rashi and the Ramban. And Rashi says, it was harder in Egypt. It'll be easier in Eretz Canaan, in the land of Israel. It'll be easier. You won't have to dig canals. You won't have to worry because God's going to take care of it all. But the Ramban, Nachmanides, says the opposite. And I'd like to follow his logic because it makes more sense to me, at least. Nachmanides says that Egypt was really the Nile. The Nile was Egypt, just as the Tigris Euphrates was Mesopotamia. These two great ancient civilizations prospered and were strong because of these rivers, which seasonally would overflow. And it was guaranteed every year they would overflow. And when it says, not like the land of Egypt out of which you came, where you sowed your seed, where you watered by foot like a vegetable garden, the Ramban says, yes, it was easy. The Nile overflowed, and with your foot, you could actually just make a little canal, and the water would come to your field, and you would have a supply of water. It was easy because it was guaranteed. And the Ramban says that Eretz Yisrael is different. Instead of looking down at the Nile, we have to look upwards towards heaven. We have to pray for rain. It's not guaranteed. And we know that's the reality in the land of Israel. There are years of drought, and there are years of heavy rain. I remember the first time that I was in Israel for Shmini Atzeret Simchat Torah, which I think is perhaps never going to be the same, at least in our lifetime. But it was decades ago. And I remember the prayer for rain. And I have to admit, Shmini Atzeret was never one of my favorite holidays. And the prayer for rain, growing up in New York, I have to be honest, I wasn't really happy to have rain. Because after all, if you gave me sunny weather, 70 degrees, I'd be perfectly happy. I don't need the rain. And living in Manhattan, try to catch a cab in the rain. You carry an umbrella, what inevitably happens? You forget the umbrella. Or if it's windy, the umbrella breaks. Rain is a pain. That's how I always viewed it. When I came to Israel the first time for Shmini Atzeret, and they started saying Tfilat Geshem, the prayer for rain, I looked around me and the people were literally praying for rain. They had a lot of kavanah because they knew that without the rain, the crops would suffer and food prices would go up. And we were very dependent on the rain. By the way, today Israel has the largest desalination plants in the world. We're a little less dependent on the rain. But still, if you've ever been in Israel for a winter, you know that Israelis are constantly checking the level of the Kinneret and how much rain has fallen and how do we compare to average years? Are we above average rain? Are we less than average rain? God wanted us to be in a country where the economy was uncertain. Unlike Egypt, unlike Mesopotamia. That uncertainty is built into our homeland. He could have placed us somewhere else, but he placed us in a place where we had to pray for rain, and it wasn't guaranteed. Let's go to the next source. One of my favorite blessings, it may sound strange, one of my favorite blessings is the blessing we say after going to the bathroom. Asher Yatzar. Deborah Bearer, I saw you before. Deborah, do you want to read for us? If we can unmute her.
Hi, sure. I'm happy to read. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who fashioned man with wisdom and created within him many openings and many cavities. It is obvious and known before your throne of glory that if but one of them were to be ruptured, or but one of them were to be blocked, it would be impossible to survive and to stand before you even momentarily. Blessed are you, Lord, who heals all flesh and acts wondrously.
So what's the purpose of this blessing? You know, there's nothing more mundane than going to the bathroom. And yet this blessing is meant to remind us that if, God forbid, we're not able to do the most elementary bodily function, we will not continue to exist. It's meant to remind us of our vulnerability. It's meant to remind us of the uncertainty. And what's the purpose of that? The purpose of that is not to make us miserable. The purpose of that is to make us appreciative. The purpose of that is to make us feel gratitude. And we all know that positive psychology says that people who are grateful, who express gratitude, generally are happier people. But I want to spend a moment just thinking about this idea of the various openings and many cavities. You know, there are 400 miles of capillaries in the human brain. In one person, 400 miles of capillaries capillaries meaning very small blood vessels. And those blood vessels, those capillaries, are the width of a hair, of a single hair. Let's think for a moment. What does it mean if one of those is closed or one of those is open, bursts? We call that a stroke. Or if it widens enough, we call it an aneurysm. And this prayer became more meaningful to me after two incidents. One was my father-in-law, Alav Shalom, a survivor of 3 concentration camps, the sole survivor of his family, a very gentle man who rebuilt his life after the war. And when he was about 80, he suffered a stroke. And he was mostly paralyzed. Couldn't speak, couldn't walk. She'im yisatem echad mehem, o im yipateach echad mehem. If one of them is closed or if one of them bursts open, Ei efshar la'amod lefanecha. We can't stand before you. And I also think about a former student of mine whose name was David Kagan. David Kagan was literally tall, dark, and handsome. He was a terrific athlete. And shortly after graduating university, he had an aneurysm in his brain and died. A life cut too short. One of them is closed, or if one of them is open, we cannot stand before you. If something goes wrong with our body, even if we're only slightly ill, we have a bad cold or a flu or a runny nose, I will admit. It's only then that we start to appreciate what good health is. This blessing is meant to remind us on a multiple times a day basis that our life is uncertain and that we need to be grateful. Let's go to the next source. The next source we're not going to read. You're all familiar with it. I'm pretty sure that most of you said this prayer on Rosh Hashanah and on Yom Kippur. But okay, let's go to the bottom of the English. Keep going. The bottom of the English, right? Who will live, who will die? Who in his due time and who before? Who by water, who by fire? Who by sword, who by beast? Etc. And this is something that it's a prayer or a poem that really does put us up against the uncertainty that lies before us in the coming year. Who on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur imagined that the events of the last 10 days would have happened? And, you come to the end, who will be at ease, who will suffer, who will become poor, who will grow rich, who will be cast down, who will be raised high. And you could be overwhelmed by the uncertainty. But then, the prayer doesn't end there. It continues and it says, but repentance, prayer, and charity avert the evil of the decree. Meaning, yes, there's uncertainty. Yes, there's danger perhaps lying ahead that we don't know about. But the prayer is pointing us in a direction of action. And I look at it generically. It could be repentance, prayer, and charity, whatever it is. The prayer is saying, don't be paralyzed by the uncertainty. Don't just be passive. There are things you can do. Let's go to the next. So again, from the book of Deuteronomy. We read this only a few weeks ago. The hidden things belong to the Lord our God, but the revealed things apply to us and to our children forever, that we must fulfill all the words of this Torah. So some of you know Tamei Mikra, the cantillation notes of Torah reading, and it doesn't appear here, but there's an etnachta. In almost every verse in the Torah and in Tanakh, there's an etnachta. And as most of you know, the etnachta indicates a pause. It's kind of like it breaks a verse in half. Where is the etnachta? The etnachta is under the third word. The hidden things belong to God. That's the pause. That's the first half of the verse. The second half of the verse is what's revealed to us, we can do something about. Again, pointing us in the direction of action. The next source is from the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. And it's really one of my favorite Rashis in all of the Torah. The Jews are at the Red Sea. The Egyptian army has surrounded them on three sides. It's looking pretty bleak. And the verse says that God says to Moshe, Ma titzak elai, why are you crying out to me? Daber el bnei Yisrael v'yisau. Tell bnei Yisrael to get moving. There's only one problem. Before this verse, nowhere does it show that Moshe is crying out to God. And Rashi picks up on that. And he says, Ma titzak elai, limadenu, it comes to teach us. Shehaya Moshe omedu mitpalel. Moshe was standing and praying. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God tells him, Lo eit atal harich b'tfilah, sheYisrael nutunin b'tzara. Now is not the time for a long Shmona Esrei. Now is not the time to spend all of your time only davening. Get them moving. Let's go to the next source. This is from the Tachanun prayer that said, most days, in the morning prayer and in the afternoon prayer very often. And I want to share a story with you. I don't know if there's anybody in this group who was in Israel during the Second Intifada. Second Intifada, which lasted from about 2000 to about 2003, was a very, very difficult time. More than 1,000 Israelis were killed in the Second Intifada. There was a terrorist attack almost every day. The day my daughter got married, there were two. And one of the worst attacks, many of them were suicide bombs, one of the worst attacks took place right on Rehov Emek Rephaim. There was a Cafe Hillel, a coffee house, that's located on Emek Rephaim, and a suicide bomber walked in and detonated himself. And I believe there were 9 or 10 people who were killed. Now, this took place on Emek Rephaim. It happened in the evening. all of us had come to learn what an explosion sounded like, and there was no way not to hear it. And two of the people who were killed were Dr. David Applebaum and his wife and his daughter, Nava. Dr. David Applebaum, an American who made Aliyah from Cleveland, founded the Terem Clinics, was the head of the emergency room at Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, where, of course, he took care of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim patients. What was he doing there with his daughter, Nava? His daughter, Nava, was about to get married. It was the night before her wedding. She had just gone to the mikveh, to the ritual bath. And he came to the coffee house to sit with his daughter for one last night before she was going to get married. Her wedding dress has been turned into a chuppah that's been used at many, many weddings in Jerusalem and in Israel. It was shattering. Never had there been a terrorist attack so close to Pardes, smack in the middle of where all of us live, most of us live. And the story of David and Nava Applebaum was particularly heart-wrenching. The next morning, we came to the Beit Midrash, and I knew that we had to call everybody together. Because, as I said, everyone was shattered. But I had no idea what to say. Rabbi Aryeh Ben David, who was on the Pardes faculty at the time, came over to me and said, I have something to say. And he got up and he said the following. He said, in the Tachanun prayer, there's a special choreography. We put our head on our forearm and bow down, bend down, like penitents. And at a certain point, we stop that and we sit up straight. But when we come to a certain point in the prayer, we stand up. And it's at this point when we say the words, V'anachnu lo neda ma na'aseh ki alecha einenu. We don't know what to do, but our eyes are turned to you. And what's the purpose of that standing up? We don't know what to do, but we're not going to stay like this, and we're not going to stay seated. We're going to stand upright. We're going to stand in a position and look around us, and we're going to be ready to do something. We don't know what that is yet, but we're not going to be passive. We're going to be ready to act. The last two sources are more contemporary. One of them is from about 100 years ago, written by Rabbi Isaac Herzog, the grandfather of the current president of Israel, who was chief rabbi of Ireland and then later became chief rabbi of Israel. And he writes the following about the Sukkah. We just celebrated Sukkot. The Sukkah, the principal feature of this festival, points out a moral of inestimable value. Unless this is taken to heart, the effects of both the New Year and the Day of Atonement will have proved to be but a transient nature. The Sukkah visualizes our life. For what is the Sukkah? A frail temporary structure intended only for 7 days. This is life. The normal span of life, the psalmist declares, is 7 decades, 7 periods of 10 each. Yemei shnotenu bahem shivim shana, ve'im b'gvorot shmonim shana. Under favorable circumstances, we may prolong our stay on the sukkah into the 8th day, Shmini Atzeret. Only in exceptional cases can we exceed these limits. How frail is our life? It is like the sukkah. In fine weather, in the sunshine of health and happiness, we imagine we are under cover, that we are perfectly sheltered. How slender is the cover? How easily we are subject to all manners of mishaps, of accidents and misfortunes which may upset our sukkah or cause it to tumble down altogether. And in the best case, our sukkah has its time limit. What a simple thought. Nothing in the world is plainer. And yet how we are apt to lose sight of this and forget the inevitable end. Assuredly, the man who lives, strives, and acts under the delusion that this life is a dirat keva, a permanent home, and not a sukkah, will not easily submit to the notes of warning and alarm sounded by the shofar, to the great lessons conveyed by Yom Kippur, and will often cast to the winds the most vital moral standards and values. Tell me not that there is the danger of the frequent thought about death tending to paralyze effort and activity. God has seen to that. Life in its fullness and richness cannot be scared away by the prospect of death. But the thought that our days are numbered, that we dwell in a sukkah, in a dirat arai, a temporary home, will exercise a chastening, a purifying influence that will help us lead a life worth living. This is the main idea that the sukkah suggests. Its very cover reminds us of the end of earth, of the awful fact that sooner or later we shall return to the dust. For the schach, the cover of the sukkah, must be gidulo min haaretz. It must consist of material sprung directly from the earth. But during your stay in the sukkah, what shall be your outlook upon life? Shall it be so morose, so somber, as to incline towards pessimism? No. You shall rejoice. V'samachta b'chagecha. Sukkot is the season of rejoicing. Zman simchatenu. There is one central master thought that will make you view life with all its trial and sufferings, life with its melancholy end in a cheerful mood. The conviction you're living and moving in the presence of God, who is the author and disposer of your life and your destiny. That is He who built your sukkah for you, and that He is the absolute good. Tov zeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Life cannot therefore be a tragedy, as pessimism would have us think. And I think what Rabbi Herzog is saying is that with all of the uncertainty of life, thinking about our vulnerability actually allows us to appreciate, be grateful, and be happier in our lives. And the truth is, with rare exceptions, we don't fall into depression when we have these reminders that we are mortal and that we are vulnerable. You know, I'm not sure everyone has this, but I know I have this. If I have a nightmare, and in the nightmare I die, or I am killed, I can feel everything up to that moment, and I can even see the funeral afterwards, but that moment of death, my mind won't let me continue to dream. I'll wake up or I'll pass over it. And I think there's a mechanism that we have, that we're hardwired not to allow ourselves too much to think about these things. But a periodic reminder is actually very healthy. Let's go to the next source. This is from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Alav Shalom, whom we miss very much. He wrote this 10 years ago, again about Sukkot, the holiday we just celebrated. Sukkot on this reading becomes a metaphor for the Jewish condition, not only during the 40 years in the desert, but also the almost 2,000 years spent in exile and dispersion. For centuries, Jews lived not knowing whether the place in which they lived would prove to be a mere temporary dwelling. To take just one period as an example, Jews were expelled from England in 1290, and during the next 2 centuries from almost every country in Europe, culminating in the Spanish expulsion in 1492 and the Portuguese in 1497. They lived in a state of permanent insecurity. Sukkot is the festival of insecurity. What is truly remarkable is that it is called by tradition Zman Simchatenu, our time of joy. That to me is the wonder at the heart of the Jewish experience. That Jews throughout the ages were able to experience risk and uncertainty at every level of their existence, and yet, while they sat B'tzila de Mehanmuta, under the shadow of faith, they were able to rejoice. That is spiritual courage of a high order. I have often argued that faith is not certainty. Faith is the courage to live with uncertainty. That is what Sukkot represents. If what we celebrate is Sukkot mamash, not the clouds of glory, but the vulnerability of actual huts open to the wind, the rain, and the cold. I find that faith today in the people in the state of Israel. It is astonishing to me how Israelis have been able to live with an almost constant threat of war and terror since the state was... Sorry, I just lost it. Since the state was born, and not give way to fear. I sense even in the most secular Israelis a profound faith, not perhaps religious in the conventional sense, but faith nonetheless in life, in the future, and hope. Israelis seem to me perfectly to exemplify what tradition says was God's reply to Moses when he doubted the people's capacity to believe. They are believers, the children of believers. Today's Israel is a living embodiment of what it is to exist in a state of insecurity and still rejoice. And that is Sukkot's message to the world. Sukkot is the only festival about which Tanakh says it will one day be celebrated by the whole world. The 21st century is teaching us what this might mean. For most of history, most people have experienced a universe that did not change fundamentally in their lifetimes. But there have been rare great ages of transition. The birth of agriculture, the first cities, the dawn of civilization, the invention of printing, and the Industrial Revolution. These were destabilizing times. They brought disruption in their wake. The age of transition we have experienced in our lifetime, born primarily out of the invention of the computer and instantaneous global communication, will one day be seen as the greatest and most rapid era of change since Homo sapiens first set foot on Earth. Since 9/11/2001, we have experienced the convulsions. As I write these words, some nations are tearing themselves apart, and no nation is free of the threat of terror. There are parts of the Middle East and beyond that recall Hobbes's famous description of the state of nature, a war of every man against every man, in which there is continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Insecurity begets fear. Fear begets hate. Hate begets violence. And violence eventually turns against its perpetrators. The 21st century will one day be seen by historians as the age of insecurity. We as Jews are the world's experts in insecurity, having lived with it for millennia. And the supreme response to insecurity is Sukkot, when we leave behind the safety of our houses and sit in Sukkot mamash, in huts exposed to the elements. To be able to do so and still say, this is Zman Simchatenu, our festival of joy, is the supreme achievement of faith, the ultimate antidote to fear. There's another article here which we're not going to get to. It's a spotlight on gratitude. It's about Thanksgiving, and I'm not going to go there. I want to summarize and allow some time for questions. I started by mentioning all of those verses and prayers which seem to be guarantees that good is going to triumph, that all is going to be fine. Why do we need them? We need them, first of all, because Judaism is a religion of optimism. And it's reassuring. And as humans, we need that reassurance that justice will prevail, that things are going to work out in the end. We need that. It's also important for us as human beings to believe in the triumph of good in the world, that truth and justice will win out. That helps us to do the right thing. It helps us to act in that way. That's why we need those sources. That's why they're part of our tradition, I believe. But why do we need to be reminded of our mortality? Why do we need to be reminded to feel insecure? And I would give 3 reasons. First of all, Ahad Ha'am, the great Zionist thinker, once wrote, "The truth is bitter, but it is better than an illusion." It is the truth that every one of us will die. It is the truth that we are vulnerable, that life is insecure, that we live with uncertainty. It's the truth. And we need to hear the truth from time to time. Secondly, as I mentioned before, the little reminders of our precarious position make us appreciate what we have. A famous rabbi named Joni Mitchell once wrote, "Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone?" And we all know that feeling of things that we miss and we didn't appreciate enough. I'll go back to the example of when we're sick, and I don't mean in a serious way, when we have a flu, when we have a cold, when we're not feeling ourselves. And we say, gee whiz, if I was only healthy again. So having those reminders makes us appreciate it when we have it, and not only to miss it when it's gone. And that sense of gratefulness and gratitude, that increases human happiness. And last but not least, as Rabbi Herzog said, if we feel our time is limited, it can help us push us to do the right thing. It can help us to use our time more wisely. If we think we have forever, we may not be using our time in its best way. Just as if our wealth is unlimited, we won't be careful about how we spend our money. The same thing should be true about our time. We should be careful how we spend our time. So, in conclusion, Jewish tradition is not so simplistic about life as some sources would indicate. Those sources are in tension with other sources like the ones we brought. And those of you who've studied at Pardes know that that's the kind of Jewish learning we do at Pardes. We try to go not only to the most obvious, but to go a little deeper, to see the nuances, to see the conflicts within the sources, to see the contradictions within the sources, and try to understand why they're all there. They come to teach us something. And let us hope that in this period of uncertainty, in this period of vulnerability for Israel and perhaps for Jews beyond Israel as well, that we'll be able to find the right responses, that we'll be able to use our time wisely, that we'll be able to develop the faith, to continue to do the right things, and to continue, hopefully, in good lives as individuals, as well as communities, as well as a people. Thank you very much.